Have you ever been taught that Black American history begins and ends with the story of slavery? That all of our ancestors were brought from Africa in chains? And that our roots only stretch across the ocean? What if I told you that this story, as widely told in schools, is incomplete? That hidden beneath the familiar narrative lies a richer, more complex history, one that connects Black Americans not only to Africa, but also to the very land we call home. For generations, families have whispered stories that rarely made it into textbooks. Tales of Cherokee grandmothers, Creek grandfathers, or distant relatives with ties to indigenous nations. These stories were often dismissed as myths or simple confusion. But as research and dinner testing reveal today, these whispers were truths waiting to be recognized. Millions of Black Americans carry the blood and legacy of native peoples, intertwined with their African ancestry, a legacy of survival, resilience, and cultural blending that has shaped communities for centuries. In this video, we will uncover this hidden history. We will explore the alliances formed between Africans and Native Americans, the families and communities they built, and the ways in which their stories were deliberately erased from official records. This is not just history, it is a journey of discovery, a chance to reclaim the full story of who we are. So if you have ever wondered about the untold chapters of Black American heritage, stay with us. Hit the like button if you find this story eye-opening, and make sure to subscribe so you do not miss future videos that explore history, identity, and the truths that schools never fully explained. Together, we will uncover the past, honor the ancestors, and understand our roots like never before. For centuries, in homes across the United States, quiet stories have been passed from grandparents to parents to children, stories that rarely found a place in textbooks or classrooms, yet carried the weight of generations. These were stories of ancestors who lived on the land long before the first European ships arrived. Ancestors whose names were spoken with reverence and whose lives left traces that endured through family memory. Some families spoke of a Cherokee great-grandmother whose wisdom guided the household. Others remembered a Creek grandfather who taught their children how to hunt and gather in harmony with the land. And still others recounted vague but persistent whispers of Indian blood running through the veins of relatives. For decades, these accounts were met with skepticism, often dismissed as imagination or confusion in the face of a history curriculum that focused narrowly on African origins through slavery. Yet the persistence of these stories hinted at something deeper, something that the official narratives had long overlooked. They were more than folklore. They were fragments of truth, passed down despite the pressures to conform to simplified histories. Families safeguarded these memories in photographs tucked into drawers, in the careful storytelling during long evenings, in the small rituals and traditions that reflected a blending of cultures, even when the wider society did not acknowledge their significance. These stories continued to shape identity, creating a sense of belonging that reached beyond the limits imposed by textbooks and government records. In recent decades, advances in genealogical research and data testing have begun to illuminate these long-guarded truths. Many Black Americans who followed the breadcrumbs left by oral histories have discovered measurable native ancestry, confirming what their families had known intuitively for generations. These findings are not isolated. Studies show that millions of Black Americans carry at least a trace of Native American heritage, a testament to the complex interweaving of African and indigenous peoples throughout the history of North America. The stories once relegated to whispered conversations in living rooms now find validation in historical documents, colonial records, and genetic data, proving that the connections families preserved were not imagined but real. This rediscovery transforms the way we understand identity, heritage, and community. It reveals a layered past in which survival, adaptation, and cooperation were crucial, where enslaved Africans and Native Americans often intersected through shared struggles, marriages, and mutual protection. The families who passed down these stories knew, without needing academic confirmation, that their lineage was more than a single narrative of displacement and endurance. It was also a story of rootedness, of a bond with the land and with peoples who had lived on it for centuries. Every tale of a native ancestor, every whispered recollection of a tribe or a family connection, becomes a thread that ties the present to a past that was nearly erased but never fully lost. Through this lens, the narratives once dismissed gain a profound significance, not only enriching our understanding of individual ancestry but also challenging the broader story of American history. They highlight the resilience of families determined to remember, even when history itself seemed intent on forgetting, and they invite a reconsideration of identity that is both multifaceted and deeply rooted. In embracing these stories, we see that the legacies carried in Black families are not confined to one continent or one culture, but are woven from the experiences, struggles, and triumphs of multiple peoples whose lives intersected long before modern records could capture them. This continuity between oral tradition and scientific validation forms a bridge across time, allowing us to appreciate the full depth of heritage and the enduring power of stories that refuse to be silenced. As families began piecing together their histories through stories, photographs, and old documents, a new and powerful tool emerged to illuminate the past in ways previously unimaginable. Genetic testing. For many Black Americans, the decision to explore their ancestry was not just curiosity, it was a quest to confirm what their grandparents had quietly insisted. To see the hints and fragments of native roots reflected in the strands of their own genetic code. What researchers found was both remarkable and validating, a revelation that millions of Black Americans carry measurable Native American ancestry, sometimes in surprising ways that intertwined with centuries of African heritage and lived experience on this land. These genetic discoveries have transformed whispered family stories into evidence that is both scientific and deeply personal. When someone traces a percentage of their DNA back to a native tribe, it is not just a number, it is a doorway into a past that was obscured by centuries of selective record keeping. Racial categorization and systemic erasure. For families whose oral histories spoke of a Cherokee grandmother or a Creek ancestor, DNA often provided the confirmation they had long hoped for, bridging the gap between memory and documented lineage. The science, in a sense, vindicated generations of quiet testimony, offering a concrete connection to ancestors whose lives were lived in proximity to forests, rivers, and sacred lands long before European colonization. But these revelations do more than satisfy curiosity, they reshape identity. When people discover that their African ancestry is intertwined with indigenous heritage, it adds depth to the stories of resilience and survival that have defined their families for generations. It confirms that the ancestors were not only victims of forced displacement and slavery, but were also active participants in the life of the continent. Forming alliances, creating communities, and contributing to a cultural mosaic that is richer than a single narrative can capture. These ancestral connections illuminate the ways African and Native Americans lived, loved, and resisted together, sometimes forming families and settlements that defied the rigid racial hierarchies imposed by colonial authorities. Across the United States, the implications of these findings are profound. They challenge long-held assumptions about the origins of Black communities, highlight the persistence of indigenous presence even when erased from official records, and encourage a revaluation of how histories are told and remembered. Each DNA test becomes a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing how millions of lives were connected across time. How migration, survival, and adaptation created bonds that defied the simplistic narratives of slavery alone. The measurable Native ancestry present in so many Black Americans is not a marginal footnote. It is a testament to the intertwined struggles, collaborations, and shared humanity of African and native peoples across centuries. Moreover, these discoveries are sparking a renaissance of cultural reclamation. Communities are reconnecting with tribal histories, learning languages, exploring traditions, and acknowledging the dual heritage that courses through their veins. In some cases, tribal nations are recognizing descendants who were once erased from membership rolls, reopening doors that had been closed for generations. The combination of oral history, archival research, and genetic evidence is creating a fuller, more nuanced understanding of identity, one that honors both African ancestors who endured the Middle Passage and indigenous forebears who nurtured life on these lands long before the first European colonies took hold. In the end, genetic studies do more than map ancestry. They validate memory, restore suppressed legacies, and empower individuals to embrace a heritage that spans continents and centuries. They confirm that the story of Black America is not a single narrative of displacement and survival, but a complex tapestry woven from multiple ancestries, cultures, and lived experiences, a story that continues to unfold as each discovery reconnects the present to a past that was nearly forgotten but never truly lost. Long before the widely taught story of European colonization took hold, Africans were already setting foot on the shores of North America, their presence documented in ways that challenge conventional timelines and reveal a more complex tapestry of early history. Spanish records show that by 1526, decades before Jamestown was founded, enslaved Africans had arrived on the Carolina coast as part of expeditions led by Spain. Their lives soon entangled with the diverse indigenous communities that had flourished on this land for centuries. These early arrivals did not merely exist as passive observers. They navigated unfamiliar territories, learned from native knowledge, and in many cases, formed bonds that would shape generations. The encounters between Africans and Native Americans were multifaceted, sometimes born of necessity and sometimes of mutual respect. In the early colonial period, survival often depended on adaptability, and both groups found ways to support each other in a world increasingly dominated by European powers. Enslaved Africans learned from indigenous peoples how to cultivate the land, track game, and understand the rhythms of the environment, while native communities recognized the skills, resilience, and knowledge these newcomers brought with them. Alliances were formed not only for survival but also as a form of quiet resistance against colonizers, who sought to control both populations and exploit divisions for their own gain. Historical accounts suggest that these interactions were more than temporary alliances. They evolved into meaningful social, cultural, and familial connections. In some cases, African men who escaped bondage found refuge among indigenous tribes, marrying into communities, raising children, and contributing to a shared way of life. These unions were acts of both survival and self-determination, creating a legacy that blurred rigid racial lines imposed by colonizers. Stories passed down through families speak of grandparents who were not just African or native, but carried the blood of both, a testament to centuries of interwoven lives and shared experiences that defy the simplicity of conventional history lessons. The presence of Africans alongside Native Americans also reveals a parallel history of resistance and resilience. Where European powers attempted to subjugate and displace, African and indigenous peoples often collaborated, protecting one another, sharing knowledge, and asserting autonomy in subtle and overt ways. Some indigenous communities provided shelter to runaways, integrating them into tribal life and preserving their dignity and freedom. These acts, often unrecorded in official histories, were critical in sustaining a culture of defiance against the forces seeking to erase both peoples from the land they called home. By the time European settlements expanded along the eastern seaboard, the connections between Africans and Native Americans had already left a lasting imprint. Communities formed with blended heritage, languages, and traditions, offering a living testimony to cooperation and cultural synthesis. These stories challenge the notion that African Americans arrived solely as enslaved laborers disconnected from the land prior to European arrival. Instead, they highlight a narrative of integration, contribution, and presence that predates much of the colonial establishment. Recognizing this history reframes how we view the early Americas. Africans were not just passengers on ships arriving after European explorers. They were active participants in the shaping of communities, economies, and cultural exchanges alongside Native Americans. Their presence laid the groundwork for relationships that would endure through generations. Influencing language, customs, cuisine, and spiritual practices. Each story of an African ancestor walking beside native allies is a reminder that North American history is far richer and more intertwined than conventional narratives suggest, and that the legacy of these early interactions continues to echo in the lives, identities, and memories of Black and Indigenous communities today. As European powers pushed further into the Americas, seeking to dominate land and people, the lives of Africans and Native Americans became increasingly intertwined, not by choice but by necessity. The imposition of colonial authority disrupted centuries-old ways of life, creating a landscape of violence, displacement, and coercion. Yet within this turmoil, moments of collaboration and solidarity emerged, revealing a shared will to survive that transcended imposed divisions. Africans, many of whom had endured the unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage, found themselves navigating a foreign world that was already home to complex indigenous societies. Native Americans, confronted by the relentless advance of settlers, recognized the value in alliances that could strengthen their communities and safeguard their sovereignty. Together, these groups discovered paths of cooperation that were both practical and profoundly human, forming bonds that would echo through generations. The alliances took many forms, sometimes subtle, sometimes bold. In the swamps, forests, and settlements that colonists claimed as theirs, African and native peoples collaborated to resist oppression, sheltering runaways, sharing resources, and exchanging knowledge. Historical accounts describe moments in which native warriors protected African escapees, risking their own safety to offer refuge, demonstrating a moral courage that challenged the rigid hierarchies imposed by colonial rule. These were not isolated acts of kindness but part of a larger, persistent pattern of interdependence, born from necessity but sustained by mutual respect and shared experience. Marriages between African men and native women became more than survival strategies. They forged families whose children carried the legacies of two oppressed peoples, embedding the memory of resistance, resilience, and unity into future generations. The alliances were also tactical. European colonizers often sought to manipulate relationships between Africans and Native Americans, attempting to sow mistrust or turn groups against one another to maintain control. Yet Africans and Native Americans frequently recognized the commonality of their struggle and resisted these divisions, forming networks that defied colonial expectations. Communities like the Black Seminoles in Florida emerged from these bonds, combining indigenous knowledge with African ingenuity to establish settlements that were difficult for European powers to penetrate. These communities became centers of cultural exchange, economic activity, and collective defense, blending traditions in ways that preserved heritage while creating new identities rooted in cooperation and shared purpose. These alliances had enduring cultural and social implications. African and native traditions intertwined, influencing language, cuisine, agricultural techniques, spiritual practices, and storytelling. Elders passed down histories of intermarriage, collective resistance, and communal support, preserving a sense of identity that could survive even under the erasure imposed by census records, laws, and societal pressures. The interwoven legacies of African and native peoples challenged the binary definitions of race that European powers sought to enforce, demonstrating that identity could be fluid, complex, and resilient in the face of systemic oppression. The story of these alliances is not merely historical. It is a testament to human ingenuity and solidarity under extreme circumstances. It reminds us that the survival and cultural richness of Black and Native Americans were shaped as much by cooperation and shared struggle as by individual endurance. By recognizing these connections, we gain a fuller understanding of early American history, one that honors the agency, resilience, and strategic vision of those who navigated a world designed to erase them. The alliances between Africans and Native Americans reveal a history of defiance, adaptation, and kinship, a legacy that continues to inform identity, community, and heritage across generations, offering a perspective that deepens our understanding of the past and its enduring impact on the present. Throughout the turbulent early centuries of colonization, amid forced displacement, enslavement, and the imposition of foreign laws, remarkable stories of human connection and resilience quietly unfolded, often hidden from official histories. One of the most profound expressions of this resilience was the formation of multi-heritage families through intermarriage between Africans and Native Americans, unions that blended cultures, traditions, and survival strategies into a living legacy. These marriages were not mere happenstance. They emerged from shared experiences of hardship, cooperation, and mutual respect, creating households where children grew up with the knowledge and values of both ancestral lines. Families recounted the wisdom of a Cherokee grandmother alongside the stories of African ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage, blending knowledge of the land with lessons of endurance and adaptability. The preservation of these multi-heritage lineages relied heavily on oral histories passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Even in the absence of written recognition, grandparents, parents, and elders ensured that the memory of both African and native roots remained alive, narrating tales of bravery, skill, and kinship that had been cultivated over decades. These narratives often included accounts of farming techniques learned from native ancestors, the spiritual and medicinal practices carried from Africa, and the fusion of languages, music, and culinary traditions that reflected a unique cultural synthesis. Each story served as a living testament to identity that refused to be erased, embedding the complexities of heritage into everyday life. From the songs sung around a fire to the methods of healing and the structure of community gatherings. Historical records, when they exist, provide further evidence of these interwoven lineages. Although they were frequently obscured or deliberately altered by colonial authorities, census takers and registrars often misclassified individuals, erasing recognition of native ancestry and listing entire families simply as Black or colored. Yet careful examination of tribal rolls, land deeds, and other archival documents sometimes uncovers names, marriages, and property transfers that attest to these blended families, even when the official record was incomplete or misleading. Family Bibles, local church registries, and community recollections preserve the connections that define the multi-heritage experience. Researchers and genealogists today are piecing together these fragments, confirming the stories that families have recited for generations and restoring a sense of identity long denied by systemic erasure. The impact of these unions extended beyond the private sphere, shaping communities and cultural practices across regions. In settlements where African and native peoples coexisted, children of mixed heritage became cultural bridges, carrying forward knowledge and customs from both lineages, often innovating new forms of language, art, and cuisine that reflected their dual heritage. In some cases, these families formed maroon communities, self-governing enclaves that combined African resilience with native ingenuity, creating spaces where traditions could thrive relatively free from European oversight. These communities nurtured generations who understood the value of cooperation, shared survival, and the blending of knowledge systems that had been cultivated over centuries. Beyond the material and practical, these intermarriages provided profound psychological and social strength. They fostered a sense of belonging that defied the imposed boundaries of colonial racial hierarchies, offering children and grandchildren a sense of identity grounded in multiple ancestries and a history of enduring both trauma and triumph. The legacy of these families illustrates the complexity of Black and Native American history, challenging simplified narratives of singular origin and highlighting a past in which alliances, love, and mutual respect forged enduring bonds. Each lineage, preserved in oral histories and confirmed in records when possible, is a testament to the creativity, resilience, and humanity of those who lived, loved, and survived in a world that often sought to deny their existence, leaving a heritage that continues to shape identity and community today. In the dense wetlands and expansive forests of the southeastern United States, a remarkable chapter of resilience and ingenuity unfolded, as escaped African slaves and Native Americans came together to form autonomous communities that defied the reach of European colonizers, blending their cultures, knowledge, and traditions into cohesive societies. Among the most celebrated of these communities were the Black Seminoles, who emerged from a convergence of necessity, survival, and mutual recognition of shared humanity. These settlements were not merely refuges from enslavement or displacement. They were vibrant, self-governing communities where African and native traditions intertwined to create a new, hybrid culture that was both adaptive and enduring. Life in these communities demanded ingenuity and cooperation. Africans brought with them agricultural expertise, craftsmanship, and spiritual practices honed through generations, while Native Americans contributed their profound understanding of the land, hunting techniques, and political structures that allowed for collective decision-making and protection against external threats. Together, they created settlements that were strategically located to provide both sustenance and security, using the terrain's natural advantages to evade the relentless pursuit of slave catchers and colonial authorities. These communities were living embodiments of resistance, illustrating how people from vastly different backgrounds could forge unity and autonomy in the face of systemic oppression. The Black Seminoles, in particular, developed a distinctive culture that reflected this fusion of African and native heritage. Their language incorporated elements of African dialects and Creek and Seminole tongues, while their music and spiritual practices blended ceremonial traditions from both lineages. The settlements functioned as both safe havens and cultural laboratories, where children learned the stories, rituals, and skills of two worlds, creating identities that were rooted in multiple heritages yet entirely unique. Marriage within these communities often reinforced the bonds between African and native peoples, ensuring that the shared legacy of resilience and ingenuity would be transmitted through generations. Beyond the internal life of the communities, the Black Seminoles also became key actors in broader struggles for freedom and survival. They engaged in armed resistance when necessary, defending their lands and families from encroachment, and in doing so, they disrupted the power structures that sought to subjugate both African and native populations. The alliances forged within these settlements were not merely symbolic. They were practical, strategic, and vital to the endurance of people who had been marginalized by official narratives and subjected to the harshest forms of colonial violence. Their victories, small or large, were testaments to the power of solidarity, ingenuity, and cultural blending in sustaining life against overwhelming odds. The existence of these communities challenges the conventional story of American history, which often separates African and native experiences into parallel yet disconnected narratives. The Black Seminoles and similar settlements demonstrate that the histories of these groups were deeply intertwined from the earliest moments of colonization, creating networks of support, cultural exchange, and resistance that cannot be understood in isolation. Through oral histories, artifacts, and surviving records, descendants continue to uncover the richness of these legacies, revealing a past where African ingenuity and native knowledge combined to create societies that were autonomous, resilient, and culturally vibrant. Understanding the Black Seminoles and other autonomous communities sheds light on the complexity and depth of early American history, illustrating how collaboration, shared struggle, and cultural synthesis were essential to survival. These communities remind us that resistance was not only enacted on the battlefield, but also through the careful cultivation of identity, culture, and social cohesion. The stories of the Black Seminoles endure as a powerful testament to human resilience and creativity, highlighting how African and native peoples forged not just survival but thriving, culturally rich communities in the face of systemic oppression and erasure. Their legacy continues to inform the identities, traditions, and sense of heritage for countless descendants, offering a window into a history that is as inspiring as it is essential to understand. As African and native communities forged connections and built families across generations, the larger systems of colonial and later American governance worked tirelessly to simplify and control identities, often with devastating consequences. The emergence of rigid racial categories in official records imposed an artificial order on people whose realities were far more complex, erasing the rich tapestry of mixed heritage that had developed through centuries of intermarriage, alliance, and shared survival. Census takers, registrars, and state authorities frequently ignored the lived experiences of individuals, reducing families with both African and native roots to a single label, black or colored. This bureaucratic simplification was not an innocent oversight, but a deliberate mechanism designed to enforce a hierarchy that privileged whiteness and marginalized those who existed outside of its narrow definitions, effectively erasing entire communities from the historical record. The consequences of this systematic erasure were profound and long-lasting. Families who had lived as kin across African and native communities found their identities forcibly rewritten, with tribal affiliations, oral histories, and cultural practices excluded from public acknowledgement. Names that had once appeared on tribal rolls or in local records were altered or omitted, making it nearly impossible for descendants to trace their heritage or claim recognition. Laws such as the Racial Integrity Act in Virginia codified these erasures, reducing the diversity of identity to a binary system that did not reflect reality. And registrars often wielded this authority with zeal, going so far as to reclassify Native Americans as black regardless of how communities identified themselves. The intent was clear: to maintain the control of a social order that could not accommodate individuals who straddled these imposed boundaries, ensuring that native influence within black communities and vice versa remained hidden, undocumented, and undervalued. Yet, despite the pressures of official documentation, families resisted in subtle but powerful ways. Oral histories, photographs, letters, and family artifacts became repositories of knowledge, preserving memories of native ancestry that would otherwise have been lost. Elders recounted the names of Cherokee, Creek, or Seminole ancestors alongside African lineage, teaching children the stories of survival, adaptation, and resilience that had allowed these lineages to endure under circumstances designed to erase them. These narratives often carried moral and cultural lessons, embedding values of courage, resourcefulness, and identity within everyday life, ensuring that, even in the absence of formal recognition, the truth of heritage could survive. The manipulation of official records also shaped broader cultural perceptions, reinforcing a simplified view of Black identity as solely African while marginalizing the contributions and existence of Native Americans within these communities. Educational materials. Textbooks and public histories often mirrored the biases of bureaucratic records, leaving generations unaware of the complex ancestry that lived quietly within their own families. Scholars and genealogists now piece together fragmented evidence from surviving documents. Tribal registries. Analysis, gradually reconstructing a fuller picture of the African and native interconnections that had been suppressed. These discoveries illuminate the resilience of communities that maintained identity under systemic erasure, revealing patterns of survival, adaptation, and pride that persisted despite the institutional pressures to conform to rigid categories. Understanding the impact of these enforced classifications provides crucial context for the layered identities present in modern Black and Native American communities. It demonstrates that the simplifications imposed by colonial and early American authorities were not reflections of reality but deliberate attempts to control, marginalize, and suppress histories that did not fit within a white supremacist framework. The ongoing work of uncovering these suppressed lineages reconnects descendants to ancestors whose identities were almost erased, validating family stories and celebrating the blended heritage that official documents sought to obscure. In recognizing the deliberate erasures of the past, we gain insight not only into systemic injustice but also into the resilience, ingenuity, and enduring presence of African and Native peoples whose legacies continue to shape culture, identity, and memory in ways that official records alone could never fully capture. In the early 20th century, the complexity and richness of African and Native American interwoven identities faced a new and calculated threat from the legal system, particularly through legislation such as Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 and the implementation of freedmen rolls across various tribes, measures that actively sought to erase recognition of Native ancestry from official records. The Racial Integrity Act, championed by white supremacists seeking to enforce a rigid social hierarchy, mandated that all individuals be classified as either white or colored, effectively eliminating the official acknowledgement of mixed-race identities, particularly those that included Native lineage. For families whose ancestors had lived as African, Native, or blended communities for generations, this legislation represented a profound intrusion into the very definition of who they were, reducing centuries of nuanced identity to a single, imposed category designed to serve political and social agendas. Registrars and government officials wielded these laws with sweeping authority, often reclassifying Native Americans as Black without consulting the communities themselves or recognizing their own self-identification. One infamous example was Walter Plecker, Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, who went so far as to alter old records, reclassifying Native Americans as colored, threatening midwives and clerks who resisted, and effectively committing what modern scholars refer to as paper genocide. This bureaucratic erasure did more than distort numbers. It erased the legal and cultural acknowledgement of Native communities, severing links to tribal lands, citizenship, and heritage, and leaving generations to navigate an identity that had been forcibly simplified and misrepresented. Families who had long maintained traditions, oral histories, and connections to tribal nations suddenly found themselves disconnected from the official recognition that validated those ties, with some communities entirely absent from government documents, censuses, and property records. The freedmen rolls, which were created to register African-descended members of tribes such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, similarly contributed to the erasure of Native ancestry. Even when these individuals possessed clear Native lineage, many were categorized solely based on African descent, separating them from their tribal communities and denying them the rights and recognition that came with belonging. Children born into families with both African and native ancestors were often officially listed only as black or colored, leaving the native half of their heritage invisible in legal and social contexts. These systemic interventions reinforced a rigid racial binary that erased the historical reality of African and native interconnections, undermining family histories and perpetuating the notion that identities could be cleanly categorized when in fact they were intertwined and complex. Despite these attempts at erasure, families preserved their heritage in less formal, yet deeply resilient ways. Oral histories, family Bibles, photographs, and local community records kept alive the knowledge of native ancestry, while cultural practices, culinary traditions, and spiritual customs quietly maintained the dual legacy of African and native roots. Stories of Creek or Seminole ancestors alongside African forebears were passed from one generation to the next, often whispered and protected from public scrutiny, forming a hidden yet enduring record of identity. In recent decades, genealogical research, DNA analysis, and digitized archives have begun to restore these erased connections, confirming family legends and revealing the depth of African and native intertwining that persisted despite the pressures of legal and bureaucratic erasure. The impact of laws like the Racial Integrity Act and the Freedmen Rolls extends far beyond historical curiosity. They shaped the lived experience of generations, influencing how families understood themselves and how they were perceived by society. Recognizing this history illuminates the resilience of African and native peoples who, through both necessity and determination, preserved their identities against the forces that sought to simplify and suppress them. It highlights the ongoing importance of reclaiming heritage, restoring erased narratives, and honoring the blended legacies that survived systemic attempts at elimination, offering descendants a richer, more authentic understanding of their ancestry, community, and cultural roots. Even in the face of deliberate erasure, African and Native American communities found ways to preserve their intertwined heritage, embedding it into the rhythms of daily life, the cadence of language, the flavors of food, and the sacred practices that shaped both individual and communal identity. In households across the South, stories of Creek or Cherokee ancestors were whispered alongside tales of African forebears, not as historical footnotes but as living narratives that guided behavior, imparted values, and connected younger generations to a past that official records had long denied them. These oral traditions became the invisible threads holding families together, teaching children about resilience, survival, and the importance of remembering who they were, even when society sought to forget. Language, too, served as a vessel of preservation. In communities where African dialects and native tongues converged, a unique linguistic tapestry developed, incorporating words, phrases, and expressions from multiple heritages. In Florida and Oklahoma, descendants of the Black Seminoles created Creole dialects that carried the echoes of African and native speech patterns, blending them with English to form something entirely new yet deeply rooted in ancestral memory. These languages were more than practical tools for communication. They were living embodiments of identity, encoded with stories, traditions, and cultural markers that allowed communities to maintain cohesion and continuity in the midst of displacement, marginalization, and forced assimilation. Food became another potent medium through which African and native traditions endured. Recipes passed down through generations reveal a fusion of ingredients, techniques, and culinary philosophies that reflect the blending of two worlds: corn, beans, and squash, staples in native diets, merged with African methods of preparation and seasoning, producing dishes that nourished bodies and connected people to their land and lineage. Meals were shared not only as sustenance but as acts of cultural affirmation, a way of declaring continuity in the face of systemic erasure. The preparation and consumption of these foods carried lessons in resourcefulness, sustainability, and reverence for the natural world, echoing the survival strategies of ancestors who had navigated the challenges of colonial expansion and displacement. Rituals and spiritual practices also maintained a quiet yet enduring presence, blending African cosmologies and ceremonial practices with native traditions in ways that were both adaptive and profoundly meaningful. From healing practices using herbs and plants to communal ceremonies honoring the cycles of life and the natural world, these rituals served as repositories of collective memory, reinforcing social bonds and moral frameworks while sustaining cultural identity. Festivals, dances, and communal gatherings became occasions to reaffirm these shared legacies, allowing communities to honor the spirits of ancestors and the resilience of those who had come before, even when the outside world refused recognition. These preserved traditions, language, food, and rituals collectively illustrate the ingenuity and determination of African native communities to maintain identity despite centuries of systemic suppression and bureaucratic erasure. They reveal a heritage that is not solely written in official records or textbooks but exists in lived experience, passed from one generation to the next through everyday acts of remembrance and practice. By continuing these cultural expressions, families ensured that the intertwined legacies of African and native ancestry remained visible, tangible, and influential, offering descendants a rich, nuanced understanding of who they are. In doing, these communities not only survived but thrived culturally, leaving a lasting imprint on the social, spiritual, and culinary landscapes of the regions they inhabited, reminding us that heritage cannot be fully erased when it lives in the hearts, hands, and voices of those who carry it forward. In recent decades, a quiet revolution has been unfolding, one that allows Black Americans to reconnect with ancestral threads that had been hidden, suppressed, or misrepresented for generations. Armed with the tools of modern science and historical scholarship, descendants are piecing together the intricate mosaic of African and native ancestry that oral histories had long hinted, but official records often denied. DNA testing has emerged as a powerful instrument in this reclamation, revealing markers of Native American heritage in families who had been told their lineage was solely African. The results often come as both a revelation and a confirmation, validating stories whispered across generations. Stories of Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, or other indigenous ancestors whose presence had been obscured by centuries of systemic erasure. Yet genetics is only one part of the story. Archival research and genealogical studies have begun to uncover documents that provide context, identity, and continuity to these scientific findings. Tribal roles, treaties, property records, and censuses, once manipulated or misclassified, are now being revisited and analyzed with meticulous care, revealing names and lineages that had been written out of the official narrative. Freedman rolls, once used to exclude African-descended members from tribal recognition, are being re-examined to restore historical accuracy, allowing descendants to claim not just bloodlines but cultural heritage and membership in communities from which they had long been separated. Family Bibles, local newspapers, letters, and photographs become vital complements to DNA evidence, filling in the stories behind the markers and ensuring that ancestry is not reduced to percentages but understood in its full human context. Genealogists, historians, and community advocates are working alongside families to bridge these sources, crafting narratives that honor both African and native roots. Personal journeys often begin with a curiosity about a family story, a grandmother who spoke of a Cherokee great-grandparent, a distant cousin remembered as having Indian blood, or a family surname associated with a tribal nation. From there, DNA testing provides a map of genetic connections. Archival research confirms historical plausibility, and genealogical scholarship weaves together the timeline of migrations, marriages, and community affiliations that make these stories tangible. In doing, individuals often experience a profound sense of reconnection, feeling the weight of ancestors who survived enslavement, displacement, and legal erasure, and who contributed to the survival and identity of future generations. The implications extend beyond personal knowledge. By reclaiming native ancestry, Black Americans are challenging narratives that have historically separated African and Native experiences, demonstrating that histories of survival, resistance, and cultural fusion are deeply intertwined. Community-based research groups, cultural organizations, and tribal councils are increasingly acknowledging these overlapping heritages, inviting participation, recognition, and collaboration. This process restores dignity and visibility to communities that had been rendered invisible by policy and prejudice, reaffirming the legitimacy of stories once relegated to family whispers. Through this interplay of science, history, and oral tradition, African native descendants are not merely discovering lineage, they are reclaiming identity, agency, and cultural memory. Each unearthed record and each verified story becomes a link in a chain connecting past and present, revealing a legacy of resilience and cultural synthesis that official erasure could not eliminate. The act of uncovering these connections transforms personal history into collective knowledge, offering a broader understanding of how African and Native peoples coexisted, intermarried, and preserved identity across centuries of adversity. In this process, families find affirmation, communities gain visibility, and history becomes richer, more nuanced, and truer to the lived experiences of those who shaped it, demonstrating that heritage, no matter how deeply buried, has a remarkable ability to endure and be reclaimed. As we bring this journey to a close, it becomes clear that recognizing Afro-Indigenous heritage is far more than an academic exercise or a genealogical curiosity. It is a profound act of reclamation that strengthens identity, fosters community unity, and restores histories that were long suppressed. For generations, Black Americans have been told that their roots begin solely with the forced migration from Africa, a story of survival and resilience, but one that overlooked the presence and influence of native ancestors who walked these lands long before European ships arrived. By embracing this fuller, richer heritage, families are able to see themselves in a more complete light, acknowledging not only the struggles endured across the Middle Passage and under slavery, but also the deep connections to the land, to indigenous knowledge, and to the communities that shaped survival, culture, and resilience in early America. This recognition nurtures a stronger sense of self. When a person learns that they descend from both African and Native ancestors, it expands the framework through which they understand their place in history, imbuing them with pride in a dual legacy that spans continents and centuries. It affirms the stories passed down in whispers, in family photos tucked away in drawers, and in rituals and practices preserved despite erasure, validating what elders once knew but could not always openly declare. The knowledge of a shared heritage fosters intergenerational connection, allowing children and grandchildren to inherit not only the narratives of survival and struggle, but also the wisdom, resilience, and cultural richness that these intertwined ancestries offer. Equally powerful is the way this recognition strengthens communities. Afro-Indigenous heritage reveals bonds between groups that history often sought to separate, highlighting alliances, marriages, and shared experiences that created blended communities. From the Black Seminoles in Florida to mixed households in Appalachia and Oklahoma, by reclaiming and honoring these ties, communities cultivate unity, mutual understanding, and a sense of belonging that transcends imposed racial categories. Cultural events. festivals, storytelling, and the preservation of language, food, and spiritual practices become ways to celebrate this shared legacy, ensuring that it continues to thrive for future generations and resists the erasure attempted by laws, bureaucracy, and social prejudice. Restoring suppressed histories also has broader societal significance. It challenges simplified narratives and educates the wider public about the complex realities of American ancestry. Scholars, educators, and cultural institutions are increasingly incorporating Afro-Indigenous histories into research, exhibitions, and curricula, shedding light on stories that were once marginalized or ignored. Each rediscovered record, each confirmed family legend, each act of acknowledgement reinforces a fuller understanding of America's past, honoring those whose identities and contributions were intentionally obscured, and giving them the recognition they deserve. In celebrating this dual heritage, we honor ancestors who survived unimaginable hardships, who protected one another, and who built communities of resilience and ingenuity. We also empower descendants today to embrace the entirety of their identity, to draw strength from the richness of their heritage, and to contribute to a living history that values inclusion, truth, and cultural continuity. Recognizing Afro-Indigenous heritage is not only an act of remembrance, it is a declaration of pride, survival, and belonging that reverberates across generations. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery, and for taking the time to explore a history that has too often been hidden from view. If this story has inspired you or given you a new perspective on identity and heritage, do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can continue uncovering the histories that shape who we are today. Your support helps ensure that these important stories are shared, remembered, and celebrated, connecting us to the past while empowering us in the present.